An elite imperial army numbering in the tens of thousands deployed to the battlefield, yet their strict orders were to avoid killing the enemy. In any other military theater across history, this doctrine stands as an absolute and catastrophic paradox. Why would a militarized superpower schedule massive, grueling engagements where fatal strikes were punished as tactical failures? Today, we unmask the grim mechanics of the Aztec Flower Wars, where combat was engineered strictly to harvest human captives. Report for duty with a like and subscribe for next week's grand assault. By the mid-15th century, the Aztec Triple Alliance held unmatched supremacy over the Central Valley of Mexico. But raw territorial expansion could not solve the profound crisis of the 1450s. A devastating, multi-year famine had fractured the agricultural bedrock of the entire empire. To the highest echelons of Aztec leadership, this ecological disaster was interpreted through a strict theological lens. The gods were starving. Their divine hunger was manifesting as agricultural collapse and mass starvation. The brilliant and ruthless imperial architect, Tlacaelel, devised a chilling operational solution. He formalized a new doctrine of permanent, ritualized conflict, known as the Xochiyaoyotl. We translate this term today as the Flower War. But there was nothing peaceful about this military institution. The Triple Alliance struck a binding strategic agreement with unconquered eastern enclaves. The most prominent and resilient of these rival states was Tlaxcalan. Instead of launching a decisive campaign of total annihilation, Tenochtitlan engineered a perpetual combat zone. These battles were strictly prearranged. The warring states agreed upon specific dates, specific neutral plains, and highly regulated troop numbers. This transformed the eastern frontiers into a highly controlled combat arena. From a geopolitical standpoint, this served a brutal dual purpose. It provided a steady logistical stream of elite prisoners for ritual sacrifice to the sun god. Simultaneously, it acted as a slow, agonizing war of attrition against the Tlaxcalans. Tenochtitlan possessed the massive demographics required to absorb constant, low-level military losses. Tlaxcala did not. The Flower Wars also served as a live operational testing ground. They allowed the Aztec military apparatus to train new generations of warriors in brutal combat conditions. The logistics of these campaigns required immense organizational discipline. Supply lines carrying maize, water, and weapon replacements had to support armies marching to artificial front lines. The imperial commanders treated these deployments as vital state infrastructure. They were literally farming their enemies. The dawn sun broke over the designated engagement zone near the borders of the Tlaxcalan territory. The Aztec vanguard marched onto the arid plain in strict, highly disciplined columns. At the front stood the veteran commanders. They were easily identifiable by massive, ornate back banners known as pamit. These towering banners were not merely decorative status symbols. They served as elevated visual anchors for tactical signaling through the dust of combat. Across the plain, the Tlaxcalan formations silently locked their shields into a defensive wall. The psychological barrage began immediately. Thousands of Aztec warriors simultaneously blew into massive conch shell trumpets. Piercing bone whistles shrieked over the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of heavy wooden war drums. The sheer acoustic weight of an advancing Aztec army was deliberately designed to break enemy nerve. But the Tlaxcalans were hardened veterans of this exact ritualized warfare. They held their ground. At a distance of 50 meters, the skirmish phase initiated. Aztec light infantry advanced quickly from the flanks. They were armed primarily with the atlatl. This wooden spear thrower acted as a mechanical lever, artificially extending the human arm. It propelled a fire-hardened dart with enough kinetic energy to completely pierce light armor. However, the strict rules of the Flower War fundamentally altered their standard targeting doctrine. Instead of aiming for center mass to achieve a highly lethal chest wound, the operators adjusted their trajectories. They deliberately targeted the lower extremities of the enemy line. They aimed to cripple, not to kill. A heavy dart through the thigh neutralized a veteran warrior for capture without ending his life. Hundreds of deadly projectiles darkened the morning sky. The Tlaxcalans raised their thick, woven defensive shields, known as chimali. Wood splintered and heavy cotton tore as the initial volleys violently struck the front line. The Aztec front ranks rapidly closed the remaining distance under this covering fire. The physical friction of the battlefield rapidly escalated. Thick dust choked the arid air, limiting visual command to the immediate front. The heavy infantry stepped forward. They leveled their primary close-quarters weapons. The true, agonizing grind was about to begin. The clash of heavy infantry was a deliberate, agonizing physical collision. This was not a chaotic, free-flowing melee. It was a highly compressed test of physical leverage, weapon control, and immense stamina. The core of the Aztec vanguard was equipped with the Xochiyaoyotl. This devastating weapon was a flat, heavy wooden staff embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades. Obsidian fractures to a microscopic edge much sharper than modern surgical steel. In standard combat, a full-force swing could easily decapitate a man or sever a limb. Yet in the restrictive environment of the Flower Wars, a lethal blow represented a severe failure of martial discipline. Aztec warriors had to perfectly control their kinetic output during the swing. They frequently used the flat wooden sides of the weapon to deliver bone-crushing blunt force trauma. They swept the heavy wooden clubs at the knees and ankles, to physically destabilize the enemy. When the opposing lines collided, the physical pressure was immediately immense. Thousands of heavily muscled men pressed against each other in a dense, suffocating formation. The primary armor, worn by both the Aztec and Tlaxcalan forces, was the Xochiyaoyotl. This was a thick, densely quilted cotton vest. It was soaked in salt water to significantly stiffen the protective fibers. It was extraordinarily effective against slashing attacks from stone weapons. The brittle obsidian blades would frequently catch, bind, and shatter in the dense cotton layers. This protective dynamic forced the combatants into brutal close-quarters grappling. The Aztec military doctrine emphasized absolute physical domination over mere battlefield lethality. Warriors locked their heavy shields together and fought for mechanical leverage in the dirt. To successfully secure a captive, an Aztec soldier had to actively isolate a Tlaxcalan warrior. He had to physically subdue a violently struggling, heavily armed opponent. This required vastly more physical energy than simply thrusting a sharp spear through a vital organ. The sheer muscular fatigue of this specific combat style was incredibly staggering. Sweat blinded the men trapped under their heavy, carved wooden beast helmets. The midday heat slowly turned the compressed battlefield into a suffocating, dusty oven. Thirst became as dangerous as the enemy weapons. Aztec commanders carefully monitored the declining stamina of their engaged front lines. They utilized a highly sophisticated tactical rotation system. Fresh ranks of warriors systematically pushed through the gaps to relieve the exhausted fighters. The Tlaxcalans matched this operational discipline perfectly. They held their unbroken shield wall firm against the immense pressure. The center of the battlefield became a tightly packed knot of wrestling, striking, and falling men. Specialized extraction teams operated constantly just behind the Aztec vanguard line. When an enemy was finally beaten to the ground, these teams dragged him backward. They bound the struggling captive's hands and immediately removed him from the active combat zone. Every single extraction created a temporary, dangerous vacuum in the front line. The surrounding warriors had to rapidly collapse the gap to maintain their structural integrity. The Tlaxcalans fought fiercely to prevent their brothers from being dragged away into the dust. They utilized the tepostolpili in their defense. This was a long thrusting spear fitted with a broad, sharp obsidian head. Tlaxcalan spearmen jabbed repeatedly over the shoulders of their front rank. They aimed for the unarmored faces, throats, and limbs of the pressing Aztec vanguard. The Aztec shield wall absorbed the heavy thrusts, shifting and grinding under the relentless pressure. The engagement dragged on for hours without a decisive breakthrough. Neither side was allowed to employ wide flanking maneuvers intended to wipe out the opposing army. The geography of the battle was artificially constrained to a direct, brutal frontal slog. The physical toll on the human body was absolute. Bruised, battered, and severely dehydrated, the frontline warriors pushed themselves to the absolute limits of human endurance. The ability to endure this specific type of localized, non-lethal torture separated the true veterans from the initiates. How do you evaluate this commander's decision to risk his best troops in such exhausting, restricted combat? By late afternoon, the sheer demographic weight of the massive Aztec Empire began to actively fracture the Tlaxcalan resolve. The turning point was not marked by a sudden cavalry charge or a hidden tactical ambush. It was dictated entirely by human exhaustion and the failure of muscle. The Tlaxcalan rotation cycles began to heavily lag behind the Aztec pace. Their front ranks were terribly battered. Their muscles were actively failing under the continuous blunt force impacts. Recognizing the subtle shift in momentum, the Aztec Supreme Commander deployed his ultimate reserve force. The Xochiyaoyotl, the elite shorn ones, advanced rapidly into the fray. These were the most heavily feared shock troops of the entire Aztec military machine. A warrior could only join their prestigious ranks after capturing at least 6 enemy combatants in previous battles. They wore highly distinct yellow uniform suits. They painted their half-shaved heads in stark, terrifying halves of blue and red. They did not march. They surged violently into the crumbling Tlaxcalan lines. The shorn ones swore a sacred military oath never to take a single step backward during combat. Their kinetic impact on the exhausted Tlaxcalans was devastating. They struck with unmatched precision. They used short, brutal grappling maneuvers to throw heavy men off balance. They exploited the tiny, fatigued gaps in the enemy shield wall. The physical mechanics of the Tlaxcalan defensive formation finally broke under the localized pressure. Individual Tlaxcalan warriors were suddenly isolated from their unit support. The Aztec extraction units surged forward, capitalizing immediately on the localized chaos. Dozens of high-ranking Tlaxcalan fighters were quickly pulled into the Aztec rear. The Tlaxcalan commanders realized their structural cohesion was completely gone. To remain on the field meant total, systematic capture. The order was desperately given to conduct a fighting withdrawal. They slowly pulled back toward their own borders. They kept their remaining shields tightly locked to prevent a total battlefield rout. The Aztec forces did not pursue them to the point of destruction.
The field is won.
The primary operational objective had been perfectly achieved. The required quota of captives was securely bound. The battlefield fell completely silent. The only sounds were the groans of the battered and the sharp commands of the Aztec officers organizing the captives. The long logistical march back to the island city of Tenochtitlan began. The prisoners were closely guarded. They were destined to be marched up the steep, blood-stained steps of the Templo Mayor. There, the non-lethal discipline of the battlefield would violently end in the ultimate lethal ritual. The Flower Wars were a masterpiece of deeply cynical imperial strategy. By forcing their enemies into a perpetual cycle of exhausting, regulated engagements, the Aztecs drained rival states. They slowly bled Tlaxcala of its finest, most experienced veteran warriors. Tlaxcala survived the era, but it was slowly being destroyed by an empire that could endlessly replace its own losses. This strict operational doctrine kept the Aztec military machine constantly sharpened. It ensured a steady flow of theological currency to sustain the dominant state religion. However, this cold strategy of perpetual antagonism sowed the fatal seeds of the empire's eventual destruction. The endless Flower Wars bred a deep, unbreakable generational hatred within Tlaxcala. When foreign ships finally appeared on the eastern horizon decades later, the geopolitical dynamic shifted instantly. The Tlaxcalans would eagerly provide the massive indigenous infantry required to finally topple Tenochtitlan. The Aztec war machine had flawlessly trained its enemies to hate them forever. What battles should we analyze in the next episode?